My dad tore up my college acceptance letters and told the school I'd withdrawn, so I recorded him admitting it and sent it to every relative who'd ever defended him. Now he's homeless, standing outside my office, holding a folder I don't recognize. There's a bench across from the parking garage on the Jefferson side, and from the fourth-floor window by the copier, you can see about 2/3 of it. He'd been sitting on it since 11. I know that because Lurline from payroll had come back from an early lunch and said, in the tone people use when they think they're being helpful, that there was a man outside who kept looking up at the building. He had a coat that was too big and a wool hat pushed back off his forehead, the way he's worn a hat since I was 4 years old. He had a green, expanding folder across his knees with both hands flat on top of it, like it might get away from him. I stood at that window with a stack of remittance advices going cold in my hand, and I watched my father sit on a bench for 11 minutes without moving. I'd built 6 years of a life on the belief that I knew exactly what he'd done to me. I could recite it. I had recited it to counselors and to boyfriends, and once to a very patient woman at a bank. By 7 o'clock that night, I would have to learn all of it over again, in the right order, with the actual numbers on it. My name is Tony Yarbrough. I'm 25, and I supervise accounts payable for a hospital system in Toledo. 4 hospitals, 11 clinics, about 900 vendors. What I actually do all day is reconcile things. Somebody in materials management enters a purchase order for 11 boxes, and the invoice comes in for 12, and the packing slip says 9. And my job is to find out which of those 3 numbers is telling the truth and why the other 2 lied. I'm very good at it. My manager once told a room full of people that I could find a variance in a phone book. I like it more than I'm supposed to admit. There's a particular satisfaction in a set of numbers that finally agrees with itself, and I get to have that feeling 3 or 4 times a week, which is more than most people get. I have a 1-bedroom off-airport highway with a balcony I never sit on. I have an associate's degree from Owens Community College that took me 4 years to get because I was working 40 hours a week the whole time. I have a coffee maker with a timer on it and a cat named Weather who is not affectionate and who I love very much. That's the whole shape of it. It's a fine life. It is exactly the size of the life you get when somebody stands at a kitchen counter in April of 2019 and makes a decision on your behalf. My grandmother Eula died in November of 2011. I was 9. I remember the funeral in pieces, the smell of the church basement, a ham, an aunt crying in a way that scared me, and my father standing by the door of the sanctuary shaking hands for what felt like an hour, saying the same 4 sentences to person after person. What I remember most clearly, though, is the week after, in her kitchen on Woodruff, with everybody dividing up the things nobody wanted, and my father crouching down in front of me by the refrigerator and saying, "She left you some money for school." That was it. That was the whole transaction of information. For school. I was 9. School was a building I walked to. I had no framework for it at all, and nobody gave me one. And for the next 10 years, that sentence sat in my head as a fact about the world, the way the state capital of Ohio is a fact about the world. Grandma left me some money for school. I never saw a statement. I never saw a number. It never occurred to me to ask for one, because children don't audit their parents. And by the time I stopped being a child, I had absorbed the sentence so completely that it had stopped being information and become furniture. $58,000. That's what it was. It had grown to about 71 by the beginning of 2013. I found that out when I was 25, in a conference room on a Wednesday. I don't want to write my father as a monster in the first act, because he wasn't one. And because the version of this story where he was always terrible is a much easier story, and it isn't true. Gene Yarbrough drove a route for a beverage distributor for 19 years. Up at 4:15, home by 3:30. He smelled like cardboard and diesel, and he had a specific way of coming in the back door and putting his keys in the bowl that I could identify from anywhere in the house. He taught me to drive in the lot behind the Kroger on Sylvania on Sunday mornings, and he was patient about it. Genuinely patient. In a way he wasn't patient about anything else. When I was 13 and got in trouble for something at school, he drove me there and sat in a plastic chair beside me and did not once make me feel like the problem was me. My mother left when I was 6. That's a different story, and mostly not an interesting one. It was him and me from then on. Here is what I understand now that I could not understand then. He was a man who managed things. He managed the route, he managed the house, he managed me, and he had a deep and unexamined belief that managing meant not telling people things that would upset them. That instinct built the entire disaster. Every part of it. He never once made a decision to be cruel to me. He made about 400 decisions to not have a conversation. Senior year, I had a counselor named Mrs. Lattimore who had 240 students and cared about all of them, which is not possible, but she tried. She got me to apply to 4 schools: Bowling Green, Toledo, Kent State, and Ohio University, which was the one I actually wanted because of a photograph of Athens in a brochure, which is as good a reason as any at 17. She helped me with the applications in her office at lunch, and in February, she gave me a stapled packet that I put in my backpack and did not read because it was a worksheet about financial aid, and it had the word asset on it in 3 places, and I was 17 years old, and it was February. She gave it to me on a Thursday, and I remember it exactly, which is unfair because there are whole months of that year I couldn't produce for you under oath. Her office was the size of a closet with a window that didn't open and a poster of a mountain with a word on it. She had a sandwich she wasn't eating. "This is the aid piece," she said, sliding it across. "This is more important than the applications, and nobody believes me. Do the worksheet first, then the actual form opens in October. You've already missed the priority date, but we'll work with it. I said, okay. Tony. She waited until I looked up. Anything in your name? Savings? A bond? Anything anybody left you? And I said, and this is the sentence, this is genuinely the whole story in 9 words. My grandma left me some money for school. Mrs. Lattimore's face did a small good thing. Perfect. Then you'll need a statement. Just the most recent one. The balance and the account number. Ask your dad. Okay. Ask him this week, because if it's a custodial account, it counts differently, and I want to see it before we file. I said okay a third time, and I put the packet in my backpack on top of a chemistry binder, and I went to 4th period. I did ask him. I want that on the record. That night, at the kitchen table, in the middle of something else. Hey, I need a statement for the college thing. The money from grandma. And he said, I'll get it. That's it. 2 words, no pause, no expression, while he was rinsing a plate. I'll get it. I asked twice more, in March, both times in passing, and both times got a version of the same 2 words, and then the letters came and everything got loud and I never asked a 4th time. That packet is the whole thing. That's the hinge. It sat in my backpack for 8 weeks and it would have taken me 40 minutes and it would have surfaced everything. And I never opened it, and I have made a certain amount of peace with that and not as much as I'd like. All 4 schools said yes. Bowling Green came first, in March, and I opened it in the driveway and screamed. The other 3 came within about 10 days of each other in April. I got home from a shift at the Speedway on a Tuesday around 6:40. The kitchen light was on. There were 4 envelopes on the counter, all of them opened cleanly with a knife, which is how my father opens mail. And he was standing at the counter with the 5th one, the last one, Ohio University, the one with the photograph of Athens, and he tore it in half while I was standing in the doorway with my keys in my hand. Not dramatically. That's the thing people never get right when I tell it. He wasn't red-faced. He didn't throw anything. He tore it in half the way you tear up a coupon that's expired, and then he tore it again and put it in the trash under the sink and washed his hands. You're not going anywhere, he said. I said something. I don't remember what. Probably a lot of things. He said, you've got a job. You've got a car. Kids go off to those places and they come back with $100,000 of debt and a degree in nothing. And then he said the sentence I carried for 6 years. The one I could still say in his exact voice. This is me looking out for you, whether you can see it or not. Then he went and watched television. I called Ohio University on the following Monday from the school parking lot on my lunch. The woman in admissions was kind and a little confused. She had my file up. She said, it looks like we received a withdrawal on the 11th. A withdrawal of what? Of your intent to enroll. It's noted here as a phone withdrawal. I didn't call anybody. There was a pause, and then the specific careful tone of a person who has just realized what kind of call this is and has no procedure for it. She said she could note the file. She said the deposit deadline had been the 1st of May and the class was closed. She said she was sorry, twice, and the second one was real. I called Kent State. Same thing, 4 days earlier. I called Bowling Green and got a woman who put me on hold for 9 minutes and came back and said there was a note in the file from a parent and that the seat had been released. Toledo I never called, because by then I understood there was no point, and because I couldn't make myself do it a 4th time. He'd used my name. He'd had my student ID numbers because he'd opened the letters. He'd called from the landline on his days off, from a kitchen where he'd raised me, one after another, over 11 days. I recorded him on the 2nd of May. It wasn't sophisticated. I put my phone in the fruit bowl on the counter, face down, screen off, and I made spaghetti, and I asked him about it while he ate. I'd planned it for 2 days, and the plan was 1 sentence long. Get him talking and don't cry. The reason I thought it would work is that I knew him. He isn't a man who denies things. He never has been. He's a man who explains, patiently, at length, from a position of having already thought it through. And I understood at 17, without being able to say it, that he would consider a full accounting to be a form of respect. I was right. That's the horrible part. He wasn't tricked. If I'd told him the phone was recording, he'd have said the same words. It ran 26 minutes, and most of it is nothing. There's 4 minutes about a guy at the warehouse named Rudy, who kept parking in the wrong bay. There's a stretch where he talks about a knee that had been bothering him. There's a place, about 9 minutes in, where he asks me if I want the last piece of garlic bread and I say no, and he says, take it, you didn't eat lunch. And I take it. That's on there. I have listened to that garlic bread exchange more times than I've listened to the confession, because that's the voice. That's the whole man. That's the same voice that said, you're not going anywhere. And the same voice that spent an hour in a plastic chair beside me when I was 13, and the same voice that called 3 admissions offices in 11 days and gave them my name and my student ID number. There is no version where he sounds like a villain. If you played the whole 26 minutes for a stranger, they'd say he sounded like somebody's dad. That is exactly why the 4 minutes work, and it's why 11 people believed it instantly, and it's why 2 of them never forgave me for sending it. The part I sent was 4 minutes and 10 seconds. In it, my father says, in a completely reasonable tone of voice with a fork in his hand, that he opened them, that he tore up the one from Athens, that he called all 3 schools himself, that he used my name because it's my name too. It's on your birth certificate, and that he'd do it again tomorrow. And then, near the end, I asked him, what about grandma's money? And he said, that's not, and stopped. And then he said, we'll talk about it when you're older. I have listened to that 4-second gap approximately 900 times. At 17, I heard a man dodging a question. At 25, I heard a man deciding, in real time, whether this was the night. It wasn't the night. He chose the other thing. And then he ate the rest of his spaghetti. I sent Sent it on the 4th of May at 11 at night from the driveway, sitting in a 2004 Corolla with the engine off. 11 people. 2 aunts, an uncle, 4 cousins, my father's brother-in-law, a woman from church he'd dated for a while, and my grandmother's sister who is 91 and does not use email but whose daughter reads them to her. I typed one line above the file. This is what happened. Then I sat there and watched the phone for about 40 minutes. Aunt Adele called at 7 the next morning and was in my driveway by noon, having driven 4 hours from Ashtabula without telling anybody she was coming. She walked into that kitchen, looked at my father, and said, "Jean," and he said, "Adele, you don't know the whole," and she said, "I heard it, in your voice, on my phone." She took me back with her for 11 days. Her house in Ashtabula is a small yellow one, 2 blocks off the lake with a screened porch that's too cold to use 9 months of the year. It smelled like cedar and dish soap. She put me in the back bedroom with a quilt her mother made and a window that looked at a garage. She didn't ask me a single question about it. Not one, in 11 days. She fed me. She is a person who believes that a plate solves about 60% of things, and she is not entirely wrong. And she put me to work in her garden. And on the 4th day, she handed me a pair of shears and said the hydrangeas needed cutting back, and then went inside and left me alone out there for 2 hours. That's when I cried, obviously. In a stranger's yard with a pair of shears. That was the design. On the 9th day, she sat down across from me at the kitchen table with her coffee and said the only thing she said to me about my father the entire time. "Your grandmother knew what he was," she said. "That's why she did it the way she did it." I asked her what she meant, and she opened her mouth and then shut it and looked out the window at the garage. And then she said, "It's not mine to say, honey," and got up and put her cup in the sink. I let it go. I was 17 and I had about 900 things in my head, and I let it go. And Adele died in February of 2024 without either of us ever coming back to it, and I gave one of the readings at her funeral. 2 years later, in a conference room with a lighthouse on the wall, I would find out exactly what she'd meant, and by then there was nobody left to tell it to. My Uncle Truman stopped speaking to my father in May of 2019 and has not spoken to him since. 7 years. At Adele's funeral, they stood 20 feet apart at a graveside and did not look at each other. So it worked. That's the thing I need to be honest about. The recording did exactly what I built it to do. It took a man who had been protected by a family's habit of finding reasons for him, and it removed the reasons. And it also did the other thing. 2 of my cousins, the 2 closest to my age, the 2 I'd grown up with, sided with him, not on the facts. Nobody argued the facts, because the facts were 4 minutes and 10 seconds long and in his own voice. They sided with him on the sending. "You aired the family out," one of them said to me at a graduation party that June, and she wasn't shouting, she was just done with me. "You could have handled it in the house." Thanksgiving 2019 had 9 people at it. Thanksgiving 2018 had 22. The graduation party was the 4th of June, and it was for a cousin's kid. And I almost didn't go, and my aunt talked me into it. She got me by the drinks table. Kendall. We'd shared a bedroom at family reunions for 11 years. We'd had a whole set of jokes. She wasn't angry, which is what made it land. She had a paper cup in one hand, and she was completely calm, and she said, "You could have handled it in the house." I said something about how it had been in the house for 6 weeks and nobody had done anything. And she said, "So, you sent it to Grandma Ernestine. She's 91, Tony. Somebody had to sit there and read it to her." I hadn't thought about that. Not once. I'd thought of those 11 contacts as a list, and not as 11 rooms with people in them. And one of those rooms had a 91-year-old woman in a chair and a daughter reading her son's voice off a phone. I said, "He tore up my life." And Kendall said, "I know he did," and drank her punch. And that was somehow the worst part, that she agreed with me completely on the facts and had still decided I was the one who'd broken something. We haven't really talked since. She got married in 2023. I found out on the internet. I've thought about that trade a lot. Given the same 17-year-old in the same May, I'd do it again. But there was a price, and I paid it in a currency I didn't know I had. There was no undoing it. I called Ohio University again in June and got someone in a different office who was extremely nice and explained deferral to me. I could defer to the following fall. I'd need to submit the enrollment deposit and complete the aid file. I was 17, working part-time at a gas station, living with a father I'd just detonated, with no cosigner on earth, and the number attached to the first year was more than my car was worth 11 times over. Grandma left you some money for school. That's what I thought I was reaching for that whole summer. I called the credit union in July and asked, and a teller told me she couldn't discuss an account with someone who wasn't on it. And I was 17, and I heard that as a rule about my age rather than a fact about the account. And I hung up and did not try again for 3 years. I started at Owens in the fall of 2019 and finished in the spring of 2023. 4 years for a 2-year degree because I was doing 11 credits and 38 hours a week, and because I failed a statistics class in 2021 while I was living in a place with a broken furnace. Those years get about 4 sentences because that's about what they were. I worked at a pharmacy on Central, and then at a call center, and then in a billing office, which is where somebody first noticed I was good with a spreadsheet. I moved twice. I dated a man named Waylon for a year and a half who was fine and who I could not really talk to about any of this. The pharmacy is the one I'd go back and change if I could change one. There was a stretch in the winter of 2021 when I was closing 4 nights a week. You count the register, you pull the will calls that have sat past 14 days, you mop, you set the alarm. On a Thursday in January, a woman came through the drive-thru at 8:52 for for a child's antibiotic, and her card declined twice, and she started crying. And I gave her the 9 days worth she could afford and told her the pharmacist had authorized it, which was a lie, and I paid the difference out of my own pocket, which was $19. I drove home and sat in the lot outside my apartment building with the heat running, and I did the arithmetic on my own life. 11 credits. 38 hours, 2 years and 8 months in at that point of a 2-year degree, and I thought about a photograph of Athens in a brochure, which by then had stopped being a place and become a kind of private punctuation mark. I never went there. I've still never been to Athens, Ohio, and it's 2.5 hours away, and I could go any weekend I wanted. Waylon asked me about it once that spring. He'd heard the outline from a cousin at a cookout, and he asked me, decently, what actually happened with college. And I opened my mouth, and what came out was the 4-minute version. My dad tore up my letters. He called the schools. I recorded him. It's fine now. He said, Jesus, why would he do that? And I said, because he's like that. That was the entire answer I had. 4 words for 6 years. Because he's like that. It closed the subject every time, and it satisfied everyone, including me. And it was the least true sentence in my whole vocabulary. Time went flat. That's the only way I can describe it. Other people my age had semesters and spring breaks and a thing called a schedule that changed, and I had shifts. My father lost the house in the fall of 2021. I heard about it from a cousin in a text, with no comment attached to it. Just, heard your dad lost the house on Fernwood. I had imagined that moment for 2 years. I had a whole scene built for it, and in the scene I feel something enormous. What I actually felt was a kind of ringing nothing. I read the text at a red light on Reynolds Road and put the phone in the cup holder and drove to work. He lost the job in 2022. 19 years and then a stretch of not showing up, and then not a job anymore. In March of 2024, a cousin told me he was in and out of the shelter on Lagrange. I didn't do anything with any of that information. It arrived, I put it somewhere, I went to work. I saw him once in those 6 years, and it was at Adele's funeral in February of 2024. It was at a graveside out past Geneva with about 40 people standing in wind coming off the lake, and I read a passage her daughter picked, and my voice held all the way through, which I was proud of in a small, ugly way. He came. Of course he came. She was his sister-in-law, and she'd fed him at that table for 30 years before she ever put me in the back bedroom. He stood at the edge. Not near the family, not near anybody. Gray coat. He'd already lost the weight by then, and I didn't understand yet what the weight meant. Uncle Truman stood on the opposite side of the grave, and the two of them were maybe 20 feet apart for 40 minutes and never once looked at each other. Truman is not a subtle man. He turned his whole body. I did not go over. I want to be honest that it wasn't strength. I stood there with the funeral card in my hand, doing the arithmetic on whether he'd approach me, and he didn't. And when I looked up, he was walking toward the road. Somebody's aunt said in a low voice, "He's not well, you know." And I said, "I know." And I did not know anything at all. And the woman meant something specific, and I didn't ask her what. I got in my car and drove 2.5 hours back to Toledo and had a shift the next morning at 7. I turned 21 in June of 2022, and about a week later, I called the credit union again, because 21 is the age in Ohio when a custodial account like that transfers to you, which I had finally looked up. I gave the woman my name and my social and my date of birth. She said, "I'm not showing anything under that social. It's a custodial account. It would be under my father's name too. Jean Yarbrough." Typing. "I'm not showing any open account with you as a beneficiary or account holder. What about closed?" And that's the word that made the conversation change. Closed. She got quiet for a second and then said she'd need to transfer me. The woman she transferred me to was pleasant and completely immovable, and everything she told me was correct. Yes, there had been an account. No, she could not discuss it with me over the phone. Records of a closed custodial account belong to the beneficiary, but a request for them has to come through the custodian of record or through a court. I asked what that meant. She said it meant either my father requested them or a court ordered them. I asked what a court order costs. She said she wasn't able to advise me on that. So I looked it up myself that night, and the answer, as far as I could work out from a legal aid website and a county fee schedule, involved opening a proceeding on my dead grandmother's gift and a filing fee and the words, "You may wish to consult an attorney." And I had $400 in checking and a car with a bad wheel bearing. I did not call my father to ask him to request the records. I want to be precise about why, because it's the least flattering thing in this story. It wasn't pride, exactly. It was that asking him would have required believing there was an answer, and I had already, somewhere below the level of language, decided there wasn't. I had 3 theories over those years, and I want to lay them all out, because being wrong in 3 specific directions for 4 years is its own kind of information. The first was that the money had been small, that my 9-year-old brain had heard some money for school and inflated it, and that it had actually been $4,000 and had gone on braces in 2014. The second was that my grandmother had changed her mind before she died, that there'd been some falling out I was too young to have been told about. The third was my mother's family, that somebody on that side had gotten to it, and that my father's silence was him protecting me from a story about my mother. I settled on the third one, mostly. Not because it was likeliest, because it was the only one where nobody I still loved was the villain. By 2025, I had the job at the hospital system and a manager who liked me and an apartment where nothing was broken. There's a joke on my team that I'm the only person on earth who enjoys a variance report. In November of that year, I found $61,000 $47,000 of duplicate billing from a linen vendor going back 19 months because a check digit was off on one line and it bothered me on a Tuesday. $47,000. I found it in about 90 minutes. It went like this. A linen invoice came through on a Tuesday and the total didn't sit right. Not wrong, just not right. The way a chord is off by one note. So I pulled the prior month, then the month before that. The vendor had two account numbers in our system, one from before a merger in 2023 and one from after, and both were active. And for 19 months, every delivery to 2 of the 4 hospitals had been billed twice, on 2 different account numbers, on 2 different cycles, and paid both times, because the invoice numbers were different, and nobody had ever put the 2 streams beside each other. I built the spreadsheet in an hour, and took it to my manager, Neely, at 4 in the afternoon. She looked at it for a long time. Then she said, 47,000, 47,800, and she laughed. Not unkindly, just the laugh people do when a number is absurd. And she said, 19 months. How does that sit there for 19 months? And I said the thing I actually believe, which is, because nobody was looking at both halves at the same time. Each one on its own looks completely normal. She wrote me up for an award. I got a gift card and my name in a newsletter. 19 months, 2 account numbers, 1 vendor, and the only reason it was ever found is that a person whose job it was put the 2 halves next to each other on a Tuesday afternoon because a total didn't sit right. Nobody ever did that for me. For 15 years, there were 2 halves of my own life sitting in 2 different places, and I was the only person alive who was qualified to lay them side by side, and I never once did it because you don't audit your own father. Nobody teaches you that you're allowed to. I did not, at any point in 4 years, turn 1 hour of that on my own family. Not one. I had the whole skill, fully assembled, and I never once pointed it at the only question in my life that mattered. And if you want to know what that is, it isn't laziness, and it isn't grief. It's that I had decided not knowing was a decision I was making, when it was actually a wall I couldn't get over. Those feel identical from the inside. That's what I'd tell anybody who's living in one. The first time I saw him was the 12th of November, 2025. I came out of the parking garage stairwell on the Jefferson side at 5:40, and he was standing across the street under the awning of a print shop that closed in 2020. He didn't wave, he didn't call out. He looked at me, and I looked at him for about a second and a half, and then I turned right and walked to my car. He was thinner. That registered later, in the car, the way details do. The second time was January at the bus stop on Adams, and he had the folder. I saw it, and something in my chest did a thing I did not enjoy, because a folder is a piece of information, and I had spent 4 years being a person who could not get information, and the man who had ruined my life was standing at a bus stop holding some. The third time was February, and Mr. Grady from the security desk followed me out. He's about 60 and has worked in that lobby for 11 years and knows everybody's name. He said, Ms. Yarbrough, that fella out there, you want me to have a word, or we can put a trespass notice on file. Takes 10 minutes. And I stood there in the cold with my badge still clipped to my coat. Not yet, I said. He nodded and didn't ask. I've always been grateful to him for not asking, because I would have had to hear my own answer out loud. The truth is that I wanted the folder. I had wanted a piece of paper about my own life for 4 years, and the only human being on earth holding one was a man I hadn't spoken to since 2019. And every day I didn't file that notice was a day I was choosing the folder over my own piece. On the 11th of March, I went down at 4:40 in the afternoon. He stood up when he saw me come through the revolving door. He'd been sitting so long that he did it in 2 stages. Up close, he looked like what he was. 62 and living rough on and off for 2 years. Clean, though. The shelter has laundry. And shaved, and I think he'd shaved for this. Neither of us said hello. He said, 11 minutes. What? I'm asking you for 11 minutes, not— He moved the folder slightly. Not for anything else. I'm not asking you for money, and I'm not asking you to say anything to me. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I turned around and told Mr. Grady we'd be using the small conference room off the lobby, and he said, yes, ma'am, and looked at my father in a way that meant he'd be right outside. The room has a laminate table and 6 chairs and a print of a lighthouse. He sat down and put the folder on the table and did not open it right away. He put both hands flat on top of it, the way he'd been holding it on the bench. I need you to look at something, and I need you to not talk to me while you do it, he said. That's the whole thing. Then he unwound the string and slid it across. 41 statements. Paper ones, the kind the credit union used to mail, folded into thirds from the envelope and then flattened out again by somebody's hand a long time ago. January 2013 through May 2017. In order, every single month. Under them, a spiral notebook, the cheap kind. 70 sheets, college ruled. He had ruled a line down the middle of every page with a ballpoint and a straight edge. On the left, in blue, the date and what he took. 1/8/13, 4,000. 3/22/13, 150. 6/4/13, 800. On the right, in black, what he was going to put back. A number, and then a month. And sometimes a note. Sept bonus. Sometimes after taxes. Once, in April of 2014, sell the boat, 2 pens. Blue for the taking and black for the paying back for 4.5 years, and I don't think that was symbolic. I think he had one of each in the drawer. $61,300. The right-hand column stops in the middle of a page. February of 2017. There is a date written and a number written, and then nothing after it. The ruled line continues down the rest of the page and on to the next 11 pages, because he'd ruled them all in advance, and every one of those lines is empty. The account closed in June of of 2017 with a balance of $214. I read all of it. It took closer to 40 minutes than 11, and he didn't say a word for any of it. And it wasn't the total that did it to me. I want to be exact about this. The total was a number, and I work with numbers, and my hands were steady for the total. It was Statement 19, October 2014, a withdrawal on the 3rd for $1,200. Eula's headstone went in the second week of October 2014. I know that because we drove out to Toledo Memorial on a Saturday, and he wouldn't let me pay for the flowers. And there was a whole thing that year about how he'd covered the stone himself, and how she'd have hated a fuss, and how it was handled. He paid for my grandmother's headstone with my grandmother's money. That's the one that got me, sitting in a conference room with a lighthouse on the wall. I asked him one question: did you ever intend for me to see this? And he looked at the notebook for a while, and then he said, I wrote it down so somebody would. Which is not an answer, and is also, I have come to think, the truest sentence he has ever said to me. He kept a ledger of a crime for 4.5 years in 2 colors, ruling the pages ahead of time. Nobody does that to hide something. He was building a record for a court that he assumed would eventually exist, because some part of him had always known this ended with the 2 of us at a table. Then he said the only other thing he said in that room. He said, the letters weren't about you leaving. And I already knew. I'd known for about 20 minutes by then, since roughly Statement 30, the way you know the end of a sentence before somebody finishes it, the financial aid packet, the stapled one, from Mrs. Lattimore in my backpack in February, with the word asset on it in 3 places. Every one of those 4 schools was going to send me a worksheet asking for an accounting of the students' own assets. 1 cycle, that's all it would have taken. 1 aid file, 1 summer, and a statement showing $214 and 4.5 years of withdrawals in his name. He didn't tear those envelopes up to keep me home. He tore them up to keep me from filling out a form. That's why he never said one word 8 months later when I enrolled at Owens with a Pell Grant and a work-study job. I've wondered about that for 6 years. Owens didn't ask for the account because there was no account left to ask about by then, and I had nothing to report. I took it to legal aid on Monroe on the 18th. The attorney was a woman named Maxine Ogletree, who has been doing that work for 16 years, and who read the notebook without any expression at all, and then took her glasses off. She told me the truth in about 6 sentences. The claim was real. A custodian who converts a minor's account for his own use has breached a duty, and it is not a close question. And if I had walked in there in 2017 with this folder, somebody would have had a very good day. Then she said something that stopped me. Whoever set this up for your grandmother knew what they were doing. I asked her what she meant. She could have left it to him. Ms. Ogletree turned one of the statements around so it faced me and put a finger on the account title. $58,000 to her son, with an understanding that it was for the granddaughter's education. People do it that way constantly. It's simpler, it avoids a custodian, and it is completely unenforceable, because the second it's his, and an understanding is not a duty. But she didn't. She made it yours. She tapped the line, with him holding it until you were 21. That's a legal duty, and it runs to you, and it means every dollar on this list is a breach with your name attached to it. She sat back. That's not an accident, and it's not a coincidence. A woman who trusts her son does not do it this way. A woman who loves her son and does not trust him does it exactly this way. And I sat in a chair in a legal aid office on Monroe Street and heard my Aunt Adele in a kitchen in Ashtabula in 2019 with her coffee. Your grandmother knew what he was. That's why she did it the way she did it. And then, it's not mine to say, honey, 7 years. It was 2 sentences and she wouldn't finish it, and now she's dead. And a lawyer I'd met 11 minutes earlier finished it for her. My grandmother built a trap for her own son out of love for me in 2011, and it worked. It took 15 years and it cost him everything, and it caught him. But there's a limitations problem, and it's a serious one, and litigating around it would be expensive and uncertain. And more to the point, she said, and she said it gently, let's say we get past all of it. Let's say you win everything. Where is the money? There isn't any. There isn't any. She closed the notebook. You can win this and collect nothing. I'll help you either way, and I'll tell you now that he knows this already, because somebody has told him. That last part landed strangely, and I didn't chase it. I should have. People assume there's a big feeling at the end of a thing like that. There wasn't. There was a parking garage, level 3. I sat in my car for a while with the folder on the passenger seat, and I did not start the engine. The thing my brain kept doing was reconciling. That's the only word for it. It was pulling every memory I had from 2013 to 2019 off the shelf and checking it against a new set of numbers, one at a time, the way I'd check an invoice. The summer we didn't go to Cedar Point because money was tight, August 2015, and there's a withdrawal on the 9th for $1,800, balanced. The Christmas he got me a laptop, 10th grade, that I was so surprised by that I cried at the table, December 2016. There's an $1,100 withdrawal on the 16th, and the laptop was $640. He bought me a Christmas present with my money and kept the rest. The boat. He put sell the boat in the right-hand column in April 2014, and he never sold the boat. He still had it in 2019. It sat under a tarp behind the garage for 5 years, and every time I walked past it, I thought it was just a boat. I ran maybe 40 of those, sitting in a parking garage on level 3 at 6 in the evening with a green folder on the seat beside me. And what I finally landed on, and it took about an hour, is that I had never in my life had a fact about my own childhood that I hadn't gotten from him. Not one. done. Every single thing I knew about who we were and what we could afford and why we did or didn't do a thing had come out of that man's mouth, and it had all been calibrated against a number I didn't know existed. Then I drove home and fed Weather and did not eat anything. So I did the other thing. I went to the credit union with the statements and requested a certified transaction history, which I could get because I was 25 and the account was mine, and the folder gave me the account number I'd never had. That branch is on Secor in a building with a drive-through canopy and 4 teller windows and a fake ficus by the door. I'd stood in that lobby before. I'd stood in it at 17 in July of 2019 with my hands in the pocket of a Speedway polo, asking a teller a question I didn't know how to ask and getting an answer about privacy that I heard as an answer about being a child. This time I had an account number. The woman who helped me was maybe 50 and she was not particularly interested in me, which I appreciated. She typed the number and her face did nothing. And then she said, "That's a closed account." "I know. I'd like a certified transaction history for the life of it." "Are you the account holder?" "I'm the beneficiary. It was a custodial account. I'm 25. She asked for my ID and my social, and she typed, and then she stopped typing and read something on the screen for about 4 seconds longer than she needed to. She didn't say anything about it. She printed a form and turned it around and put an X by 2 lines and said it would be 9 business days and $22, and did I want it mailed or would I pick it up? Pick it up. And then, as I was signing, without looking up, she said, "You want it from opening or from when the deposit stopped?" Which is the closest thing to a comment anybody at that institution ever made, and I have thought about it a great deal, because it means she could see the shape of it on the screen, and she was, in her way, asking me if I already knew. "From opening," I said. It took 9 business days, 14 pages, certified, with a stamp and a signature on the last one, which is what made it a thing that existed in the world instead of a thing my father wrote down. Then I wrote a demand letter. Ms. Ogletree helped me with the form of it. Dates, amounts, the duty, the total. $61,300, not a lawsuit. A written demand, served, and then filed with the county along with the certified history. I did not do it to collect. There is nothing to collect and there never will be. I did it because for 4 years the only record of the largest event of my life existed in one place, which was my father's handwriting, in a notebook, in a folder, on a bench. And I wanted it to exist somewhere that was not him. He signed the acknowledgement of the debt at legal aid on the 9th of April in a room I was not in, and Ms. Ogletree called me afterward and said it was done. I found out about the rest of it in June, and I found out by accident from Mr. Grady, who has a nephew who works intake at a transitional housing program on the east side. To get into that program, the long one, the one with the caseworker and the 2-year bed and the job placement, an applicant has to document their financial obligations. All of them. In writing, signed. He'd had nothing. No lease history, no judgments, no garnishments, no record of any kind. A man with no paper is a man they can't build a file on, and he'd been cycling through 90-day beds for 2 years because of it. The acknowledgement was the file. Somebody at that program told him, sometime last winter, that if he could get one substantial obligation documented and acknowledged, they could work with it. And he thought about what he had. And what he had was 41 statements and a spiral notebook and a daughter who worked in a building on Jefferson. He got a bed in May. I have not seen him since April, so now I get to sit with this. He gave me the only true thing he had, and it was the truth, and it was complete, and every word of it was verified. And he also needed me to have it. Both of those are the case at the same time, and neither one cancels the other. And there is no arrangement of them that lets me feel one clean thing. I keep the certified history in a fireproof box with my birth certificate. I gave the notebook back to Ms. Ogletree's office to hold because I did not want it in my apartment, and I could not throw it away. The pages he ruled in advance and never filled in, there are 11 of them. I counted.